Professor Stephen Raymar, Area Chair of Finance and Business Economics, and I welcome you to this delightful seminar today. We're having Alice Tepper Martin, President and founder of President Emeritus and founder of Social Accountability International. She has a long history in social innovation activities. I'll be introducing her in a moment. But first, this webinar is organized by Gabelli School of Business and Finance and Business Economics, along with Responsible Business Coalition and leading people in organizations area. And the chair of that area is Michael Pearson. He will say a few words about RBC. Take it away, Michael, and back to me.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Alice, for joining. And the Responsible Business Coalition is an effort at Fordham and in the bigger network of really creating a new perspective on the role of business in society. And the conversation that we'll have is a conversation that has been long in the making in terms of how we can reconceive general business activities as part of our social commitments and the social fabric, rather than outside of it. So the Responsible Business Coalition is a coalition of many businesses right now in the fashion sector that I think will and have learned a lot from Alice Tepper Martin, and will continue to learn to ensure that we're meeting these SDGs, but also creating a world that works for all through and with business and business education. So I thank you for this opportunity. Back to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Michael. So again, it's my honor to introduce Alice. She has just devoted her whole life to these kinds of topics. Early on in the very late 70s, she managed the first social investment portfolio management service. She has a degree from Wellesley College and also from NYU, and she taught NYU's first Business and Society MBA course. Over the years, she has been always interested in assisting humanity and helped found the Social Accountability International to help with manufacturing and supply chain across the world to keep our international businesses on a fair, ethical track. So it is now my proud honor to introduce Alice, who will lead the webinar today. Later, if there are some Q&A, just put your questions into the Q&A box and I will help field them later. But take it away, Alice. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Steve and Michael. Margaret Mead has famously said the most powerful thing in the world is an idea whose time has come. Well, I had the great good fortune to have that occur to me when in the mid-1960s, a religious institution approached the Wall Street firm that I worked as a securities analyst for and asked us to manage their portfolio, but not invest in any companies that were supplying weapons for the war in Vietnam. So after developing the peace portfolio, I wanted to expand that idea to other areas, to the environment and to civil rights, but I couldn't get the data. So I founded an organization called the Council on Economic Priorities. Let's see if I can bounce this now. Oh, hold on. Here we are. Okay. We evaluated the corporate social responsibility of US corporations on a comparative basis. Who were the best companies, who were the laggard companies. We began with investors in the mid-60s. That was a very radical idea. It was way off in a tiny niche. But just recently, it's become a very powerful and prominent force. So I'd like to read you what Forbes has to say about this just very recently. Forbes says there's no doubt about it. 2020 was the year that the environmental, social, and governance movement in capital markets and financial services came of age. For example, ESG, that's environment, social, and government bond values, reached a record high of over $489 billion this year. Fidelity International reveals that in the first 3 quarters of 2020, stocks with the highest ESG ratings had better returns in every single month except April. And the fund flows are increasing, with sustainable funds surpassing $1 trillion in the second quarter of this year. Deloitte forecasts that ESG mandated assets could make up to half of all managed assets in the US alone by 2025. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, being launched this month with 30 of the world's biggest asset managers, sets a goal of achieving zero net carbon emissions across their portfolios by 2050, with interim 2030 targets. This will surely lead, says Forbes, to changes in the operations of the huge number of corporations they invest in. And finally, COVID-19 has redirected investor focus on how companies approach social risks, including what we're going to be talking about today: human capital management and supply chain working conditions. So we began with investors as leverage, but soon we realized that once we were able to rate in a well-researched and objective manner the social and environmental records of US companies, that information could be made available to other sources of influence. We had our our 15 minutes of fame with a book called Shopping for a Better World. You could look up the brand of any product you could buy in a grocery store and find out whether it was a leader or a laggard on a range of 9 different social issues. It sold 1 million copies. It was covered in every major newspaper in the country. We talked about it on Good Morning America, on the Today Show, and it transformed the value of brands from price and quality to values. We measured improvements every year and continued to get publicity for a while. This was a really interesting way of promoting a book because we had no advertising. We self-published it first. Eventually, Ballantine Books picked it up. But it sold that 1 million copies without any advertising. So that was so unusual that Adweek made me Woman of the Year for a no advertising promotion of a book. The next major movement in this was when this got on the desk of managers. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today. It really began when Fortune magazine began to run the Council on Economic Priorities ratings of which companies did the best on diversity, best for women, best for minorities, and on and on. They still do these, best for families and so on. And that meant that managers, not just people outside the company, not just outside stakeholders, but the managers themselves and the executive suite, were really interested in getting to be number one, getting to be the best in their sector at a whole range of social and environmental issues. That was really powerful until around the late 1980s. What happened in the late 1980s was a total disruption of the Council on Economic Priorities and all of the various organizations and investment groups and consumer organizations that were evaluating companies, US companies, on the basis of US culture, US values, US benchmarks, US laws, and access to data in the United States. Because activists were looking at what was happening in the communities that were most vulnerable, where increasingly factories were located, making the products that we and the Europeans and the Japanese were buying. So And let me give you an idea of what kinds of things these were. These weren't just activist campaigns. This is a picture of a glass factory in Vietnam. One of our staff members was just walking by and walked in and looked at it. Take a look at what you're seeing here. The workers in this glass factory are children, a lot of them elementary school age. You see this bucket in the center? That bucket is full of molten glass and it's precariously balanced on an old brick. Right underneath it is a child with no proper shoe protection, just wearing flip-flops of some sort, sandals. All over you see wires that are electrical fire dangers. And the worst part of this is that the reason that the person walked inside that factory was what was happening on the outside. Because on the outside were children who were deformed because of accidents in that factory. Their families had rejected them. They wouldn't go back to school. They were just hanging around outside the factory, but the factory wouldn't hire them anymore. So this is the kind of thing that we were seeking to avoid, to improve, and to help companies avoid inadvertently having factories like this in their supply chain. So we moved from a project at the Council on Economic Priorities to totally transform the organization. We renamed ourselves to become Social Accountability International, and we looked to global norms and global systems. We began by bringing together key stakeholders to develop a consensus-based voluntary standard called SA, or Social Accountability 8000. Those stakeholders, half of them were corporate executives from major companies. Half of them were trade union leaders, NGOs, nonprofit organizations who worked in developing countries, and campaigners. Once we developed the standard and released it, we began accrediting organizations to verify compliance to SA 8000. And what we do primarily now is to train managers, auditors, and workers, and to build capacity for decent conditions in workplaces around the world. What's in the SA 8000 standard and what we train people for and what managers seek to implement are these 8 elements that are all drawn from, not from US laws and US data and US benchmarks and cultural values, but from United Nations ones, conventions that are signed by the great majority of countries around the world. But instead of complex documents about how countries should manage these things, we reorganized it, drew out what's relevant for workplaces, and put it in the kind of language and system that companies were used to managing. And that's international standards, international voluntary standards, gathered most famously ISO 9000, which is a management system for quality control. But we applied it to elements like child labor, forced labor, decent health and safety, freedom of association, lack of discrimination, absence of abusive discipline, reasonable working hours, and remuneration that both meets local laws and it eventually gets to be a living wage. All of that placed in a management system, the Plan, Do, Check Act that managers are used to working with for quality. And we applied it to the elements that are in SA 8000. Now there are over 2 million people working in facilities that are certified. That means an independent outside auditor inspects them. In our system, that's every 6 months, and shows that they meet the requirements of SA 8000. These facilities are in 65 countries. They're in a wide range of virtually every industry. and many more facilities implement SA 8000, but either haven't seen a reason to apply to be certified, or they're progressing toward full compliance. What does this mean on the ground for workers? Well, we wish we had more data on that than we do, but we have a fair amount. And what it shows is that workers experience fewer injuries and accidents. There is better adherence to labor laws, and workers are made more aware of what their rights under labor laws are. There are more opportunities to organize, compensation has gone up, and communication with management has improved so that when workers see problems, they can bring it through channels to let managers understand them and seek together to address them. Some of these are the most elementary things. These two slides are real factory conditions. They're from very early in the system. These pictures are 20 years old. But on the left here, you see what was the source of drinking water in a factory that was supplying manufactured goods to a major European company, headquartered in Germany. People were shocked. The people in the buyers in this country had never been to the factories. The factory people, salespeople would bring them products and talk to them about delivery dates and quality and price and so on. But the buyers didn't go to the factory in those days. So when they started to go and take a look, they found this water well and a large number of workers getting sick at rates that should not have been expected. So they did something fairly simple. They brought in a nice Swiss filter system, and everybody had potable water. Here's another example. On the left, you see a very fire evacuation unsafe situation with narrow corridors. Fire could spread factory. It's a garment factory. And there was no access for the firefighters to get in, and the routes to escape were blocked. So it got reorganized into a facility with less fabric, easily where it could catch fire easily, where there are clearly marked exits, and people are trained in fire escape. Now, what about employers? Why do the owners and managers want to do it? Well, increasingly what we've seen is greater employee retention, which we expected, the implementation of effective management systems, better brand reputation, and what did surprise us was the quality and productivity also went up. And increasingly global buyers are attracted to the factories that do well on these. Today, what we do primarily is training and capacity building. These are some of the companies we work with at SAI, and SAI is not the only organization in this field. There are a group of others that do very similar things and do a good job at it. But we work with a wide variety of companies from around the world, HP, Walt Disney, small ones like Eileen Fisher, high-end companies like Gucci, ones that sell to a more middle-class group like VS or Cole Haan, and many others. I'm going to spend a little time telling you about two of the systems and tools that we work with these companies on today. One is called Social Fingerprint. We named it because we say every company has a social fingerprint. It's a unique mark that they leave on the world, and it tells everyone how they do business, and it provides a comprehensive measure and improve system. Social Fingerprint has three different elements. The first is for the facility, the factory, or the farm, or the store itself. It looks inside that facility to see how they manage social compliance with and for their workers. The second level of this is for supply chain management. That's the global system, the managers at retailers and brands around the world. And it looks at how that company can manage social compliance throughout a supply chain. Now, for a company like Eileen Fisher, you're talking maybe 25 to 50 suppliers. You can get your head around how to do that. But we're working with companies, and we're also working a little bit with Amazon and with Walmart. We're talking about companies that have hundreds of thousands of factories around the world in virtually every every country in the world that does any manufacturing or growing and exporting. So it's a very complicated job. And attached to this is a training center, so that when people have gone through social fingerprint, they can look for training and tools and ways to improve, either online or for classroom training. You could actually go to the SAI website and find social fingerprint and click on it and take one of their self-assessments to find out a lot of the details that are involved. It asks maybe 90 questions, this self-assessment. And actually, when I teach this course at NYU, we give every student fills this out and takes the role of being a supply chain manager, and then gets their scores back, and a few of them are used for classroom discussion. So the self-assessment tool is a tool for measuring what the company does now and how it can improve, to assess their risks. And as soon as you've answered those fairly simple questions online, it takes maybe an hour or two, you send them in and you instantly get your grades and can go back for generic improvement ideas. The next two levels of it for the supply chain manager, that's the company sitting at Walmart and Gucci and HP, is to get a remote independent evaluation. That's where either staff at SAI or at the buyer company looks at documents to support how a company is, a producer is implementing what they say they've done in the self-assessment. There's a telephone interview, and then they get feedback. They get the independent evaluation compared with their own evaluation. And it benchmarks it against other factories in, well, maybe in the whole supply chain, or just in the India supply chain, or just in the glass supply chain of the global buyer. That enables the buyer, the brand or the retailer, to be able to know which of their suppliers are doing the best on providing decent workplace and which are doing more poorly, but more importantly, what they're doing well in and how good their own ability to evaluate themselves is. Do they have a realistic idea of how good the conditions are or not? And they can see this all graphically. And then for the global companies, the next step is a field verification, and that is to go in and have inspectors actually look at the factories, interview people, workers, managements, look around, and verify the results. And the most advanced of these companies, very few do this, but the most advanced will then publicly report on what those findings are. We were very pleased to find that the independent evaluations were very close to the findings of the field evaluation. So these independent evaluations are pretty reliable. They're a lot less, not fully as good, but very close to field verification, and immensely faster and cheaper. which means that a large global brand can evaluate a larger number of supplier facilities and can get the results back in a similar time frame. So in perhaps with a 3-month window for the facilities to respond, a company can get a picture of how well all the factories supplying them in whatever subset of that they want to choose are doing in comparable time frames and for large numbers of them. What is it that we're looking for in this evaluation? What should the producers themselves and the brands be looking to improve in? The system for improvement shows ratings from 1 to 5. So in each of these areas, they get back a grade in 1 to 5. That includes the policies, procedures, and records, an assessment of for the brands, for the managers of the global companies, the risk assessment and supply chain segmentation, how well they manage their own supply chains, how well integrated compliance and sourcing is. That means are the buyers actually paying attention to these ratings? Are they making clear when they place orders that they matter? And are they increasingly shifting their buy from companies that not only are doing poorly, but are not working to improve to the companies that are doing well, and especially to the companies that are working hard to improve and moving quickly? They should be improving their communication and purchasing practices to reflect how important ESG and decent working conditions are to them, and to rewarding them and communicating clearly to the suppliers that if they treat their workers more decently, they will get better deals. Then it looks at how they track and remediate and how they maintain complaints. Because SA8000 and similar, the more robust to the company and industry codes like the EICC one in the electronics industry, they do not at any point purport to guarantee that conditions are perfectly decent in a workplace at every single moment. They can't possibly do that. What they do say is that there's a system in place which says if a worker or a manager finds a problem, a non-compliance with the standard, there is a system in place to identify it, to report it, to remediate it, and to evaluate what went wrong and fix your policies and your procedures to seek to prevent a recurrence. And then how well you're engaging with external stakeholders. Then I want to tell you about one more thing, and then we can turn it over a bit to questions and discussion. But this is the capacity building. So we've been looking at monitoring and systems for ensuring decent work. But what we find for many companies, not so much in electronics, but a whole range of consumer goods, all of the all of the areas where there are low barriers to entry, where production is in very poor countries, where people are desperate to get any job, because even what we view as an abusive job is better than what they may face otherwise to be in a level that by world standards is below the extreme poverty level. What we're seeking to do is find ways to make improvement work and then be self-sustaining, so that we begin to get decent workplaces everywhere in the world and throughout the supply chain of the brands that we consumers buy from, investors invest in, and people work for and want to work for. So we have many different ways we work on that. There's training programs of all sorts. We train managers, auditors, and workers in their own programs. But the thing we found most effective is a program called 10 Squared. And that's unusual because it's a program where workers and managers are working together to identify and solve problems. It's a highly structured 100-day workplace engagement program that takes groups of 10, 5 managers appointed by management, 5 workers elected by the workers. And they work together to find what they think are, well, for instance, if it's in workplace safety, they look for what the hazards are. Separately, the workers and the managers each come up with a list, and they map the workplace to identify where those hazards would be. And then they come together and they compare it. And almost invariably, the workers are able to identify hazards in the workplace that the managers weren't aware of. And they begin to come to some agreement about what those hazards are they real, and what would they like to see change. And in many places where we work, this program we've been managing in Turkey and Brazil and in China, these are all societies where it's very unusual to from workers and managers to be working together. Generally, they're working in opposition. There's little communication. There are vast educational, economic, and social and cultural differences between the people who are managers and the people who are the workers, and not a lot of communication between them. Now, this is not the case every place. These systems work very well in Europe, in the United States as well. But in the countries where we've worked, this is a real accomplishment by itself. After the first day session of this, at the end of that day, what happens is that the managers and the workers have been required to come back to the facilitator and say, we have agreed on the following goal that we believe we can accomplish together in only 100 days. And it's a system that's a single factor, it's simple to understand, and any of us, managers and workers, can measure progress, and we will every single week throughout those 100 days. The results have been really remarkable. What we have found is that where we've instituted this at 43 companies, is in more than 15 different industries, is that 93% of the teams achieve their goal within 100 days. And now the facilitators are urging these teams to pick really ambitious goals. They're not guaranteed anything by the company but the time. They have to find the resources to do this. They have to figure out how to do it. They have to take responsibility and communicate it to the other people in the factory as well. And usually at the beginning, they look at these goals and they say, there but with the help of God, how could we possibly do this? But 93% achieve those goals. Let me give you a couple of examples. And we do it through game playing, by the way. All the way through in this, we have games. We figure out what's the most, like in Brazil, what everybody loves is soccer. So we start off talking about soccer. Suddenly, people who weren't very engaged in the project, they're all in to talk about it. And then we give them some games with balls. And then we start introducing the tools and systems they can use to make a plan, to find resources, to check and make it actually happen. So here are a couple of examples of particular factories. One in fire protection. Their team set a goal to reduce the number of chemical fire risks by 80%. In only 100 days, that's roughly 3 months, they were able to eliminate 40 of the 50 fire risks they'd identified. Now think about that. They had identified in their first day sitting together 50 things in their workplace that were fire risks. Within 100 days, they eliminated 40 of them. And after the 100 days, they were able to eliminate every single one of them because that team kept working together to reach their full goal. Look at accident prevention. This is another factory. They wanted to reduce the number of accidents to 0. They were focusing on handcuffs, slip and fall cuts, slip and fall injuries, and accidents from exposure to extreme heat. In 100 days, they didn't have a single accident. They got the rate to be 0 accidents, when before it was about 7 every month. Then another one, and this is one that many of the teams did, and that was emergency preparedness and response. You know, here in the United States, I would suspect that every single person listening to this webinar, when they were a kid, they had fire drills, right? Wherever they work, if you work, there are fire drills. It's something you just take for granted. In many of these workplaces, we are talking about managers and workers who've never in their life have had a fire drill. They never even heard of it. They've certainly never had one. So the goal here was, these were factories that had begun to have fire drills. It was taking them more than 15 minutes to evacuate the factory. Now, if you're looking at a factory like those garment factories we looked at, even the better organized one, if it takes you 15 minutes to evacuate the factory when there's a lot of flammable material around, or the factory itself is old, where there's a lot of wood, let me tell you, people will die. Maybe a lot of people will die. If you get down below 4 minutes, people won't die. They will all get out before anyone is consumed by the fire. So in this particular factory, the evacuation time was reduced 80%, from more than 15 minutes to 3 minutes and 12 seconds. So these are real concrete and significant results you can get when you get a team with a clear goal, measurable inputs, real commitment, fun because of the games, and workers and managers working on it together. Even if they never consulted each other before, even if they didn't distrust, even if, you know, the workers said the managers will never pay attention to us, the managers will say, these people are uneducated, you know, they're not going to understand how to do any of this. They're never going to know where to get resources to get it done. So what we're seeing is not only the kinds of improvements we just looked at, but organizational change, improving the culture of the factory, so that the principles of the program and the organization structure and operations are changed so that they can identify and address and improve challenging situations. And also professional development. We found that workers who would never have aspired to think, you know, I could be a manager. and managers saying, you know, I've got these goals to meet. And we found out here that talking with the workers and getting them to help us really help us achieve our goals. So that's worth doing. It helps us to do our job better. So if you'd like to know more about these things, you can take a look at our website and subscribe to SAI's newsletter. I'd like to get a little bit of feedback now, even though it's a little, actually we're right on schedule. Now is when it's time to hear comments and questions and discussions from all of you, my fellow panelists and the people who tuned into this webinar. I look forward to talking with you and hearing from you.
Alice, this is Steve. Audience, thanks very much. Very delightful talk. And, well, I don't know if delightful is the right word. Challenging, thought-provoking, maybe that's better. Let's see. Are you showing us something different now you want to comment on?
Oh, no, I didn't. Those are some slides. If questions come up asking about particular things, I can use them for illustrations.
Good. Well, I have a question. It has to do with reaching out to the companies or countries with whom you've had success. How do you manage to do that? And are there certain types of countries or certain types of companies that are more open to these types of strategy analyses?
Yeah, I think countries, um, the countries most open to it and where our messages can be heard best are the countries where there are domestic stakeholders and government that also want to improve working conditions. And this can be applied not just to working conditions, but to environment and a whole range of issues. Um, so if, if a company or the country is only interested in trying to convince the buyers that they're doing what they want, but they're not motivated and developed themselves, and they don't have stakeholders, consumers, government, NGOs, domestically pushing them to do it and calling on them to do it. What you tend to get is a game of how to fool the auditors. You want to get that certification, you falsify records, you tell your workers that when they're interviewed by those auditors, this is what they have to answer. And you train them how to answer questions that have nothing to do with what the reality is. And you frighten them. If you don't give these answers, your job may be at stake. What you get then is false certifications. You get buying companies that are placing orders in factories where the dangers are grave. But when you're talking about a country like, well, Brazil, India is a perfect example. India is a country with enormous workplace problems, enormous poverty and disparities. But there is a very, very active, diverse group of stakeholders who are calling for better conditions. And there's a government that's supportive of this. Government has sent out programs to tell workers, to tell companies why they should improve their working conditions, what SA 8000 is, why it's important to implement it. Italy is another country. Surprisingly, there are a lot of certifications in Italy. And Italy, it's because the trade unions are independent, active, and already work with managers quite well. And where, at least in northern Italy, a number of the regions have implemented regulations and grant and loan programs that help finance improvements and reward companies that have achieved them.
Thanks very much. I see that Michael has a question. Go ahead, Michael.
I have many, and I'll start with one. And I first of all want to thank you for doing this and the amazing work that you've done over all the decades. What do you see as the biggest gap now that you're sort of saying this is mainstream, it grew out of the niche? What is the biggest gap yet to fill? And then maybe a second part of the question, what role do you see business education play?
Well, the second part's easier. Business education is that it should, just as Forbes said, companies are integrating ESG, investors, consumers. It has become a part of the strategic management challenge and opportunities for companies. And our students who may work for companies, so that includes business school students, but also liberal arts students who eventually end up, for one reason or another, even if they didn't intend it when they were undergraduates, working for companies. And they need to understand both the importance of these issues, the integration of the social and environmental with profitability and success in their own careers and in their company's fortunes. And they need to know that there are systems and tools that they can rely on and organizations they can work with in order to be effective at that. Sorry, I think I got so interested in the second part of the question, I may have lost the first part. But
well, I guess the biggest gap that you see in terms of making this completely mainstream, or what you say, strategic and integrated.
Oh, the biggest gap. Wow, there are so many gaps. I think on the workplace level, the biggest gaps are one, union busting, countries where organizations of workers and managers and owners have no trust and refuse to work with each other. And that's not just the managers. In many places, the unions refuse to engage in any cooperative effort to make things better. All they want to do is campaign. So that's a huge one. Decent compensation, living wage, an enormous challenge, and exacerbated by COVID-19 and the suffering that these companies and that workers have endured, both those who have gotten sick and those who've lost their jobs. And the factories that have closed. Those are two. I mean, don't get me started on gaps. There are so many, but those are two majors.
So I guess I have a bias. I think business education does play a role for sure, and I think you were interested in that part of the question. But what do you see? Because it sounds like you are focusing on the practicing managers and educating them, quote unquote, re-educating them around those issues. Where do you see is that? How would you, if you had a magic wand, where would you put it in terms of like getting, I don't know, getting yourself out of business? Is that the kind of question to ask? Like, why?
Yeah, that would be great. That's our greatest hope, is that we won't be needed anymore. You know, I think what universities can do is to integrate this kind of thinking and systems into every course, and for business schools particularly, and certain schools where people might take these courses, economics, for instance, or undergraduate business, to develop a whole department. Just as in a company, there's a CSR department that focuses just on these issues. But their ultimate job is to work themselves out of business, really just to be a resource, because the buyers, the lawyers, the communications, everybody in the C-suite has integrated these issues and how to manage for them into their jobs. But similarly, in the business school, there needs to be a business and society section that has a whole bunch of programs, research, and courses on ESG factors. And then something from them needs to be integrated into every other course. And there needs to be links so that ideally these business and society courses given in, say, business school like yours, also are pulling students from other disciplines into the course, and they're learning to think about this in a cross-disciplinary way, and rely on each other for information and ideas. Does that make any sense to you, Michael? I'm not primarily an educator. You are. You've got a better sense of this than I do.
But
so
I mean, I'm listening for certain things that you are saying, and I want to hear something more. And I actually do want to have a follow-up conversation at some point, because I think many educational institutions are in the space of transforming that. I think a lot of help is needed.
Great.
Steve, you're muted.
Steve, you're muted. I see you.
Sorry. I see a question from Mr. Baptiste about how do you think this could affect living conditions for a whole person, in addition to working conditions, which I think you focus on?
Yeah, enormously. Many, well, some are just indirect. So um, much of if a worker works in an environment where they're exposed to toxic chemicals, this is an extreme problem with agricultural workers at farms that are not integrated pest management or organic. And they're exposed to pesticides being sprayed in the air while they're in the field often, or working in fields replete with pesticide that has been applied in a variety of different ways. Now, if they go home and hug their children and hug their um, their significant others, those toxic chemicals are going to have toxic effects on their whole families. So that's just one example of how dangers in the workplace are communicated out to the community. Um, Another kind of effect is when the programs, the capacity building focuses on community. So what many of the companies we work with do is they think, gee, if we're going to put some budget into improving conditions, we would make the most significant improvements if we put in a better mm, pure water system for the whole community, not just inside our factory. We would be able to recruit many more and better workers if their children have a decent school. And if we, for reputational purposes and moral purposes, want to prevent child labor, we don't want kids working in our factories, our ability to limit that within the factory is vulnerable if the children have no other choices. But if we invest in schools in these poor communities, there's going to be a pull as well as a push. The children are going to they're going to be better educated when they grow up. But in the meantime, they're going to have something useful to do that's good for the community and good for them. And they're less likely to fake their IDs to convince workers that, convince managers to hire them, and in other ways, despite good systems to get jobs that are dangerous for them and that hinder their ability to break out of the cycle of poverty by getting a decent level of education.
I see Michael had a question about for the ESG components. Some countries may have different emphasis than others. For instance, Michael is thinking that in Africa, maybe it's more on social issues than environmental. Any comments in that direction?
Yeah, certainly. What you find huge differences among companies, among countries, and it has to do both with their leadership and with the degree of poverty, um, and um, and you know to what degree they're threatened. But right now, I mean, the driver right now is climate change, right? And the African countries are less, they are hard hit by the effects, but they're not a major contributor. Um, China is enormously hard hit by the effects, not just of climate change, but also of pollution, air and water pollution. That is the thing that is most damaging to their health, the health of their citizens, and also most likely to motivate people to want to protest and rebel and threaten the stability of the Communist Party. So China has put a very, very high emphasis on reducing air and water pollution and their contribution to global warming. And as a result, it is becoming increasingly and has become a powerhouse competing with us in areas of advanced technology, in solar, in electric cars, and it's proving to be a winning combination, improving the health of their people, improving their stature in the world, and improving the competitiveness and growth of their economy.
Well, there's a range of questions that could build on, going from how to deal with Brazil and how to have influence over China, which seems to be moving in your direction. But let me just make it more narrow in case we run out of time. What do you think of the Amazon union fight?
I don't have a lot of expertise in that, Steve. Can you answer that? Did you ask that question having an answer yourself? Please give it.
No, in the sense that back here at home in the United States, you know, I was watching John Oliver on Sunday night, as I always do, and he was talking about the labor conditions at Amazon, and they're having a union battle in Alabama.
Amazon, the company. I thought you meant Amazon, the river, the district.
Actually, yes, I should have clarified. I did mean Amazon, the river, when I said Brazil, but then domestically, I mean Amazon, the company, and the union fight in Alabama, and the worker conditions in the U.S. at Amazon, the company.
Yeah, I actually did a whole comparison between Walmart and Amazon recently, the year before last, for a gathering of this social funds. I mean, it's so amazing to me when we started this and there were the first socially responsible funds. There were a couple dozen of us together, all of us in a room. And now the annual conference of this group, there were 800 people there. And they were not just from the social funds per se, but from virtually every major investment house, all of which have, some large, some small ESG programs. And I was looking for examples of where they could which companies they could make a big difference in. And the first company I wanted to talk to them about was Tesla. It turned out the social investors were not heavily in Tesla because they were a little afraid of the high PE. They were concerned about a technology crash, stock crash. But they were all heavily in Amazon. So I was looking at Amazon because Amazon is a company that, for me, represents both a nightmare and a dream. And if you look at the enormous impact Amazon has, just look at transportation. At the time I did this 2 years ago, the cost of transportation for Amazon had increased to 12% of their total costs, and it's been growing up since. So the nightmare is a lot more trucks, a lot more nasty packaging, a lot more traffic as polluting truck after polluting truck was carrying Amazon stuff all over. The dream is that Amazon would turn to an all-electric, would work towards an all-electric fleet, and would have their energy generated by alternate sources, so that the energy running those trucks would come from wind and solar and hydro and geothermal. Then I did a comparison between Amazon and Walmart, and Walmart was actually doing more on each of these issues than Amazon. But in the next 2 years, Amazon has been moving to catch up. You've seen a dramatic improvement on things like giving consumers one day when all their packages could be delivered together so that there are fewer packages in using less less packaging in encouraging consumers to do the same. So there's enormous potential here. That was just one of the nightmare versus dream categories. So the leverage that consumers have and investors have and managers have at these fast-growing tech companies is enormous, and at the same time threatening and promising. In the Amazon, in Brazil, I mean, that's just an unmitigated disaster right now. Bolsonaro is the the poster child of denying COVID-19, of making fun of mask wearing, of doing nothing to lead the country to manage it better, and also has been opening up the Amazon to a huge incursion of environment damaging, tree cutting commercial activities, and there has not been a very effective movement to stop them.
So listen, Alice, some people may want to be leaving at 12:30. I think maybe that was the advertised ending time, but if you wish, or if people want to stay, there was a question from Ms. Wells. If you have time, maybe, field it. Can you speak on this issue of sourcing cotton from Xinjiang in China and human rights violations with the Uyghur population? And, what can companies do about that kind of ethical issue in supply chain management?
Yeah, it's the situation for the Uyghurs is heartbreaking on a hardly imaginable scale. There are more than 1 million Uyghurs who are mostly Muslim group on the western side of China. Very, very poor area in China. And China is trying to wipe out their culture, re-educate them, and has rounded up more than 1 million of them and put them in what they call re-education camps, which are enclosed by wire. They're, compared to concentration camps, they're not actually gassing and murdering people, but they are abusing them, trying to get them to renounce their religion, their culture, not allowing them to speak their own language, and so on, trying to make them into Han Chinese. And it's heartbreaking. And there are factories that these imprisoned Uyghurs are working in. And companies, many are, and all of them should try to do something about it. What to do about it when China considers that an internal sovereignty issue that we have no business poking our nose into. And China is feeling very confident on human rights era because they did so well with COVID-19. They're feeling that much of the world will hold them out as a model rather than the United States, because at least until Biden came in, until this year, we were doing among the most poorly in the world. So it's decreased our stature to be able to pull a human rights card. Companies are faced with the same kind of problem they had with apartheid. In apartheid, in the early years, there was a divestment movement, and companies were being pressed to not to stop doing any business in South Africa because of the egregious apartheid system. And many companies were divided about what to do because they said, well, if we leave, that will make things worse for the minority populations in South Africa because they'll lose their jobs. We need to stay there and try to improve things. And they brought in something called the Sullivan Principles, which worked with their suppliers, initially in the auto industry and other industries as well, to try to improve things. Eventually, the changes achieved that way were judged to be too incremental, though they did result in some improvements. And the divestment and many other factors led to the successful ending of apartheid. Companies now are making some of the same kinds of, having the same kind of thought process about the Uyghurs. They're saying, gee, if we don't give these people work, things will be even worse for us. But the majority opinion is that the right thing to do is not be sourcing from the Uyghurs, both for their own good and also for our own reputational risk management. The problem is it's very difficult to do because these factories are very far down in the supply chain. So where brands and retailers have made a lot of progress in more responsibly managing their supply chain are in the first tier of their suppliers. That is the ones they directly place orders with. They then ask those suppliers to be responsible to their sub-suppliers, and the more progressive, the more effective companies in supply chain management will also start inspecting and building capacity at second tier and third tier contractors. But the Uyghurs are often very, very far down the supply chain. They may be 6 removed from the company that the global US or European company is buying from. And without much better systems for transparency all the way down in a system where it's very easy to fool people and to hide who your subcontractors are, it's challenging.
Well, okay, Alice, listen, on that sad note, but on a happy note for your excellent presentation, I think we're going to bring this to an end. I thoroughly enjoyed your comments, and many of us will take it to heart. Mike, did you want to have any last comment?
No, I just want to thank you for joining us, Alice. It is a privilege to hear from you, and I'd love to stay in touch. And I know that I've gotten some questions from my area chair colleagues to see how we can implement more of this in the context of our education system. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
I'm really delighted to hear that. It's been a pleasure working with both of you, Steve and Michael. Thank you so much.
Okay, audience, the seminar is now over. And thank you all for joining us. And most of all, thank you, Alice. Have a good day.
You too.